Today's kind of a history lesson is what it is. Because what we're going to learn about today is actually the early church, of when it all got started, and it went from disciples and Jesus to actually what made the first church service, and how did that get started, and what were church services like around that time. See if you can, I'll give you a little quiz here. Who are these two? Some people would say that they are probably the earliest influences of the church, the earliest leaders of the church. Any ideas? Close, very close. Who said that? Right over there. Very close. This is Paul, right here. But this is a guy that doesn't get very much notice. I mean, it's always Peter that you see with Paul. That's James. That's the brother of Jesus. When Jesus ascended and the church first got started, the disciples voted that James would be the leader of the church. So James was actually kind of the first bishop. As a matter of fact, that's basically what he was called. The word bishop basically means guardian or overseer. And so he was the one that oversaw the church in Israel. He was the first one. And oddly enough, he was not a disciple of Jesus during the time that Jesus was hopping around. As a matter of fact, his brothers they thought he was nuts. They didn't really believe in anything that he had to do. They actually thought that he had some problems. And it wasn't until the resurrection that they realized that they had the Son of God right there. Changed James everywhere, and he's the one that kind of led. Now these two, right off the bat in the church, we had conflict very early on, because Paul, he got called to preach to the Gentiles. And he said, the Gentiles are non-Jewish. And so he went out and he's preaching to the Gentiles. James was a very staunch Hebrew. It was Jewish. He valued the tradition of the Jews and the requirements of the Torah, which means the books of Moses. So the laws, how to eat things kosher, how to stay clean and things like that. He was very strict on that. As a matter of fact, if you read one of the letters from Paul, this is another place where they were it'll show kind of the personalities. Paul talks about no matter what we do, we're saved by grace. James, on the other hand, actually said, we're saved by grace, but it also depends on what you do, how you live your life. And so we had some rigidness there, which caused our first church conference, and they've been boring ever since. This is, they all gathered and they said, okay, what are we going to do about the Gentiles here? How are we going to allow the Gentiles into the church? Because a lot of people, you see, the rule was that the Gentiles, if you went into Jerusalem and you went into the temple, a Gentile even stepping into the temple area, the worship area, could get him killed because they were considered pagans. They were considered heathens and unclean. And so a Jew would not even eat with a Gentile. And so Paul's changing something extremely radical here. He's saying, not only are they going to eat with us and be with us in the synagogue, but they're going to worship with us, and we're going to share our God with them. That little bit of information there. See, now we're Christians and we say, everyone is welcome and all this kind of stuff. But back then it wasn't so much. It was a little bit of a private club. And so that was where the first argument came. And then the second argument was, okay, if we let them in, what are we going to let them do? You see, a lot of these guys were saying, look, in order to be a Christian, you have to become a Jew first. You have to follow the Jewish traditions, which means it doesn't matter how old you are, you have to get circumcised. Ouch. That's, and Paul is saying that's a lot to ask an adult male to do. And it's also a lot to ask that they follow the dietary restrictions and all of this stuff, because these guys, they don't know this stuff. We're sons of Abraham. We grew up with this stuff. But we're asking these Gentiles to completely change everything about them and to assume that they know what we're talking about. And they don't. And that's why Paul said they just need to be a good Christian to come in. And so they agreed to allow them to not have, they said basically follow the 10 Commandments. If you follow the 10 Commandments and the teachings of Jesus, we'll grant you. We'll grant you in. But historians will tell you that this was an agreement, but it was a rigid one. It was one that continued arguments throughout the entire time, and it actually would lead eventually to the separation of the Jews and the Christians. Now, I'm not saying Jews and Gentiles, because most of those Christians we're still talking about were Jews. But because of this, what other staunch Jewish people considered as a pollution, they separated themselves. So the early churches were not allowed to be in the synagogues anymore. Plus, the Romans had had enough with them, and they were persecuted. People were hunting Christians. It was deemed as a very a bad religion. There was actually a place where they would actually, in hiding, they would have to. We didn't have churches, and we didn't have synagogues. So where would you meet? You would meet in somebody's home, and that's where they would meet for their church service. And surprisingly, their church service was a lot like it is today. What they would do is they would get together and they would sing hymns and psalms. Paul, even in one of his letters, actually recites a hymn that we no longer use anymore, but it's one that he was recognized by and one that they sang in their churches. And then they would have a reading of what they would call the biographies of the apostles. In other words, the Gospels, the New Testament. And then they would have somebody give a teaching on that scripture. And then they would have what was called the agape meal. Agape is Greek. The Greeks have about 6 words for love. So whenever you see love in the Bible, know that sometimes it means even more. Sometimes it means a little bit less. But agape love is the huge love. It's overwhelming. It's God love. And they would have this agape meal, and people would bring whatever they had, and we gave birth to the first potluck dinner in a church. And I believe even then they had that green bean casserole, that everybody would make. And so they brought those, and they would have this meal. And then they would follow the meal with communion. And it wasn't a real, it was a celebration. It was more to celebrate Jesus saying, "Do this in remembrance of me." It was a way of saying, this is our community. This is who we are. And the early churches, they also, it was very important that if you joined the church, if you became a Christian, that you were baptized. And they did it by full submersion. They'd march out to the lake and they would dunk you. And we talked about that, the 7 times and everything like that. And that's how they would join the church. And the only restriction that they would have was that they wanted you to be a Christian. But see, they're hunted, so they had to come up with like a secret symbol that they would mark either on the doorway of the house, or if you met somebody and you didn't know for sure if they were a Christian, you'd go down in the ground and you would make a symbol like this, kind of just a thing like that. And then the other person, if they were Christian, they'd know what you were doing, and they would finish it by doing this. You see what I'm making there? The fish. The same fish that's on the backs of our cars. That's the exact symbol that our early Christians used to identify that this was a house, a safe house, and that this was a safe place to be. Now, the fish symbol was actually used way before Christianity. As a matter of fact, the cross was actually used way before Christianity. Those were symbols that had been used by pagans before. The fish was actually often used for fertility gods. The cross was used almost as decoration. But early Christians, they started using the cross by making marks on their forehead or sometimes on their chest. It was a martyrdom symbol, basically. It was saying, I believe so strongly, I will die the same way that Jesus did. And so, but more, they didn't really have, these were homes. So they didn't have decor or anything like that. Nobody had a cross in their house or anything like that. They just had a sketched-in little fish on their door. And that's when people knew that it was safe. Now, I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit because I know that we don't have a lot of time, but I want to get through a lot of years here. So we're going to jump to the first century. Even after persecution, the Christian church had been around for almost 100 years, and it was surviving still. It was that important for the early Christians to keep it going. They faced martyrdom, they faced penalties, they faced persecution by both the Jews and the Romans, but it still survived. And as a matter of fact, they even started to become kind of a community of their own, this kind of secret community. And they had people that became Christians that also had money, and they were able to finance things. There's a Roman governor, his name was Pliny the Younger. I don't know where they got their names. But there's a letter that we still know that he writes to the Emperor Trajan, and he's talking about the Christians because his job as governor is to persecute the Christians. And he actually writes the emperor and kind of says, now why am I doing this again? Because I've looked into these Christians, and the way that he reports it is, he says they're good people. The only thing, they're just a little weird. They get up at dawn and they sing their hymns, and they finance to help the poor, and they finance to put kids in school, even back then. And he said they take a vow to do no harm and to live an upright life. He said the only thing that they really don't do is they won't join the military, because they believed in the early church when Jesus said, live by the sword, die by the sword. He told Peter to put his sword down. They became pacifists. And he also said that the only thing that they don't do is they don't worship our pagan gods. You see, back then it was very important to not only worship the pagan gods, but to make offerings to them. And Christians would not do this. The thing that made Christians separate is no matter what was going on in the secular world, they would not take part of it if it was sinful. If those true Christians were around today, you wouldn't see them in probably movie theaters or are going to bars or doing a lot of the things that we kind of have, made part of our lives. They didn't. And so they were kind of looked at as weirdos, There's this kind of weird little group that didn't do these things, and they wouldn't make sacrifices to the pagan gods. That upset them. And so what they would do is they would just say, look, are you a Christian? And this governor would just say, look, if you would just make a sacrifice, you can just go home. Everything will be fine. He was almost saying, you can just fake it. Just, put a couple bucks there and walk away, and you'll be fine. The Christians wouldn't do that. They said, I won't do that. I'm a Christian. and they were killed. Every one of them was martyred. They were killed in very brutal ways. And this was their punishment. There was a woman that stands out. Her name was Perpetua, and it was around 203 A.D. She was a Christian, and her martyrdom really challenged the system. One, when she was captured, she was pregnant. She gave birth to her baby in a cell because she was ready to be put into the arena. See, they love to do this with Christians. They love to put them in an arena and unleash tigers and lions and things like that and just maul them. And then sometimes they'd be mauled so severely that a Roman soldier would have to come and put them out of their misery by stabbing them to death. But the thing was to prolong the pain as much as we could. They tried to get her to deny her faith because this was a black eye even for the Romans. Her father even tried to physically get her to say that she was not a Christian. And she wouldn't. She refused. She believed so strongly that even knowing that she was going to die and never see her child again, this was something that was very important to them. This was something that they had a backbone that's, I think, unfortunately, we've kind of lost. And there's a story that she was out there. They put her out there, and she was mauled by wild animals, by tigers and things like that. And the Roman soldier came, and he couldn't do it. He couldn't kill her. He was shaking so bad because it was such a moving thing. She took the end of his sword and she plunged it into her own neck. She finished the job herself, the job that the Roman soldier couldn't do, because it was that important to her that's when they died. I will die a martyr before I will give up the faith. So we had those kind of things happening in our early church. They also asked bishops. Now, bishops at the time were religious leaders in the various communities. So I'd be a bishop. That would affect my pay, wouldn't it? Just a little dream. They had, at one time, an order that the bishops would take the scriptures. Again, we're calling them the biographies, the holy words. Turn them over to Rome. Turn them over to Rome, and we won't kill you. This was that important. This book that we have here in so many different languages and in so many easy ways. We can get it on our phone. We can get it in anywhere. This was life or death. If you turned this in and let them destroy it, they would not kill you. Some bishops did that. And some bishops were called traidors. It meant worse than turning over. It meant turning against God. And there was a sect that would not even forgive them for that. Now, we're going to jump ahead even more. 312 A.D. At 312 A.D., we meet this guy. Some churches actually call him a saint. This is where, in order to tell history here and to tell it honestly, we're going to get a little touchy. And before I do this, I want to say, I have nothing against any denomination. I consider my friends in different clergy in different churches as loved ones. This is just history, okay? So we're going to get a little controversial here, but when I came to town, I told you guys I was going to preach the truth and not necessarily what you wanted to hear, but I was going to preach just what there was. Okay, that being said, this guy's called a saint. He was an emperor. He worshipped a lot of other gods. And he would have like these visions. Well, one time he is getting ready to go into battle. And he has this dream of looking up into the clouds, and he sees a cross. And so he thinks to himself, if I put this cross on every weapon, if I put this cross on every shield, I'll win this war. And he did. The very next day, he was painting crosses on everything. And they held it on sticks, big, long sticks with a cross hanging on top of it. And they marched into battle, and they were victorious. And so Constantine then decided to become a Christian. And for the first time in 300 years, Rome was now governed a Christian state. Now, Constantine worshipped Jesus, but he also worshipped all the other gods too. He still continued to do a lot of the pagan stuff. And what this started, where a lot of people had problems with this, is because it started a governing church. The first thing he did is he brought in bishops, and he made them his consultants, his right-hand men. Now, he still had the final word on everything, but he had his bishops now close to him. Some of the bishops were the ones that turned over the scriptures to save their lives. And so Constantine started to build this kind of Christian government. And he had this, he conferred with the bishops on how a Christian should be and what exactly they should believe. And the way that he dealt with people other Christians that didn't exactly believe the same way, he martyred them. He put them to death. So they say that Constantine actually killed more Christians after he became a Christian than he did any time before. He was dividing and conquering Christians. He was the first person to not tax churches. He designed churches. The churches that we have today, the steeple, the cross, that's Constantine. That's his doing. He designed all of this. Remember, before this, they were meeting in homes. He designed the church. He designed the decor. He designed the pomp and circumstance of Christian churches. This was part of him. Now, the controversy that we get into is that he still wanted us to worship his other gods. There was a I'm not going to get into this a big deal, but there was a god, Isis. She was considered a mother god. She was considered not to do any wrong, and people would worship her as much as they would worship Jesus. He added that to the Christian faith, which is where we promote Mary. As a matter of fact, the Isis churches and temples at the time were converted to temples that worshipped Mary instead. There was a Roman god, Mithraism. And what they would do is they believed that their god was a symbol of a bull. And what they would do is they would slice the bull and they would eat the bull and drink its blood. And they thought by doing this, they were, by consuming the god, they were bringing in the Spirit into themselves. It changed the way that we do communion in many churches. Many churches, they do believe that Christ actually becomes in body form, and we basically eat him. Our church, our denomination believes that this is in remembrance We believe that that's the way that the early churches did it. It was a remembrance on community and on Christ's sacrifice on the cross, but this is still bread, that's still grape juice. It will be all the time. We're just doing this in remembrance. It's a tradition. It's something that the churches felt very strongly about, that tradition, but they didn't believe that they were eating flesh at the time. So a lot of these things changed. There's more, but it also put bishops into a very powerful role. They had decisions that could actually cost people their lives. There was a sect of Christians that rebelled against this. Some of them headed off into the woods, basically never to be seen again. They lived as hermits. These were the first monks. They dismissed all of the church or even just life in general of the way that things were, and they left. And they separated themselves from everything. And they lived a very pious life. And that's where the monks came from. Now, we break off here with our first real big group here. This is a very gruesome picture. It's a mosaic that people found. It's the Donatists. Donatists, they were a North African group. Now that's still under Roman territory, and they were named after one of their bishops. They refused to acknowledge the emperor's influence on the church. To them, they felt that we needed the Scripture, and we go by the Scripture. The only thing that they did is that they said nobody can take communion unless they're baptized. Also, they had a hard time forgiving other bishops. The bishops that turned over their scriptures to the Romans to avoid persecution, they said that they would never, ever be allowed to do a baptism or a communion, and if they did, the baptism was invalid. They held clergy of those days to a very high regard. And you had to walk the walk, and if you didn't, you were out. It was very strict. Rome started to persecute them at the hand of the bishops. They'd argue for a while, and they tolerated them for a while. But then they started to hunt them, and they started to persecute them. And so, not very long, just about 300 years into this, we have Christians against Christians fighting for traditions, fighting for how you dot the I and little differences. We have our first, basically, denominations going to war against each other, and it's in bloodshed. And this is how they would take care of these guys, is they would martyr them and put them into pens and have them mauled to death. This, for some reason, they survived the persecution until about 420 A.D., and then they were actually annihilated by the Turks. The Romans were not able to touch them. So we have the first real argument going on here. The next thing that, after that, basically, it was the Catholic Church, and they kind of, went their own way. It wouldn't happen again until 1382, when a man by the name of John Wycliffe thought that everyone should have a Bible. You see, before then, you could maybe look at a Bible, but it had to be in the hands of a priest. And when they read it in church, it would be in Latin. Well, if you're in Germany or London, you don't know what they're saying. And it caused a lot of pastors and a lot of clergy to become quite corrupt. Buying your way into heaven actually became very well known. It's supported the church for many years. If you had an infant that wasn't baptized, they would say, unless you pay us, that infant's going to hell. They would say, you're going to hell unless you actually pay to get out of it. That would be mostly there were a couple of other things. John Huss that tried to do the same kind of similar thing. He was burned at the stake, and that led us to 1517, where it's the Reformation, where Martin Luther hangs his thesis on the door. And that's when the Protestant churches began. That's when it started. That's basically when we separated. We were one church with little rebellious facets until then. But boy, it was confusing. You know, we jump ahead now to 2014, and Christians are still fighting, aren't they? We're still not getting along. It's very funny that a denomination will argue with another denomination. Or they'll say that this is the true church and that's not the true church. When, as early as 300 AD, that argument is when that started. No, we're the church of Peter. No, we're the church of Peter. No, we're the ones that actually started it. You guys have gone off on your own. No, actually, it's the other way around. And we've been having this argument ever since. So what do we do as Christians? How do we take this history? First off, it's not the Catholic history. It's our history. It's the Christian history. Our Christian heritage has so many skeletons in the closet, we had to buy a house that was just a closet. We have so many black eyes. We have done it so wrong. How do we get it right? Why are we still arguing with one another? And why are we still feeling questionable of whether or not we're actually worshiping God? You see, it has nothing to do with this. It has nothing to do with the decor, like I said. This was a faith that started in people's houses, or even in little hidden places out in the woods. See, God's not found in a house. God's found in the heart. God's wherever you take him. And that's what Jesus was trying to point out. And that very Last Supper, when he was doing the communion, he gave a final commandment, that you love one another, even as I have loved you. Love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples. By this alone, they'll know that you are my disciples. If you love one another. He was back in heaven for a pretty short time before we messed that one up. The best thing to do as Christians is realize that it's that simple. If you want to know what it's like to be a Christian, or what it means to be a Christian, it doesn't, not the denomination, not whether or not you celebrate a certain thing or hang a certain thing or light a candle, not light a candle, walk a certain way, wear a certain gown. It's whether or not you love one another as you love Christ. If you want the abbreviated Bible version, the version that should be in English in every translation, it's that. Just love one another. It's that easy. And know that Christ loves you. Christ is in your heart. It's not in a denomination. It's not in an argument. We've got a black eye, very much so. You know, basically that's how communion started. And it has gotten so blown out of proportion since then. It was a meal that people would have together, a potluck. And they would enjoy their fellowship. People would bring stuff. And they had community. And then at the end, they would unleash this. They would take the bread and they would say, remember when Jesus did this. Remember when he said that this is his body and he dies for us. And then they would say, and remember when Jesus passed around the wine and he said, this is my blood which I shed for you. And remember when he said, do this in remembrance of me. You see, that was actually the first church service. And that's the only one that really got it right. It was something that everybody was invited to. I've said this before, I'll say it again. When Jesus broke the bread, Judas was sitting at the table. He shared his body and his blood with the person that he knew was going to betray him. He even washed his feet. It's about accepting everybody. It's about settling our differences, and it's about sharing the love of Christ. And if we can keep that simple thing, then it doesn't matter where we go. It doesn't matter who we run into. It doesn't matter whether or not there's a cross or a fish on the wall or nothing. It matters whether or not Christ is in our hearts and whether people see Christ in us. If somebody comes in here and says, I'm looking for Christ, I hope they look at us. Not of whether or not we have clean pews or vacuumed floor, or whether or not we do communion at the beginning of the service or end of the service. I hope they just look at our hearts. Because that's where Christ has always been. He's never been in a building. He's never been in a denomination. He's been in our hearts. That means he's in every denomination. That means he's in every building. That means he's wherever we go. And if you keep Christ in your heart, everywhere you go is a church.